Hello, this is Ubuntu Gicha. Nowadays, mobile devices such as smartphones and tablets are used far more frequently than desktop devices, including laptops. Even on desktop devices, the number of macOS and Linux users is steadily increasing. Since users utilize a variety of devices and operating systems, if you use a font that is only available on a specific device or operating system, it may be displayed in a different style in other environments. For example, even if you use Georgia or Times New Roman to use a serif font on Windows, these fonts are not available on tablets, so the text may appear in a sans-serif style unintended. To solve this problem, one method is to use generic font families. A generic font family is a method of classifying fonts by visual style and using them as generic font names. This involves using sans-serif instead of specific font names like Sego or Arial, and serif instead of Georgia or Times New Roman. By doing so, you can maintain the same style even in environments where fonts exclusive to a specific operating system are unavailable. Unfortunately, however, the reality is that web browsers do not properly support generic font families. Generic font families include serif, sans-serif, cursive, and fantasy styles, but in practice only serif and sans-serif are supported, and even then, proper support is limited to English. In the case of languages such as Korean or Japanese, the reality is that operating systems do not properly support fonts other than Gothic, which corresponds to sans-serif. In this global era, using various languages together is common practice. If only English displays in a style consistent with a generic font family, the overall screen becomes awkward. Not only do system fonts in operating systems fail to properly support generic font families, but even within the same style of generic font, line heights and weights are inconsistent, leading to an awkward appearance when various languages are used together. Nodo is a font designed to achieve overall visual harmony across diverse languages. I personally recommend it because it maintains consistent serif and sans-serif styles across a wide range of languages. Since Nodo is distributed under the Apache License 2.0, it is often pre-installed on many operating systems. In Ubuntu, if you install a language pack, the Nodo font for that language is automatically installed. Of course, in Windows, it is not built in by default, so you must download and install it separately. I will examine the current support status of generic font families in web browsers and discuss methods to resolve this issue. I will check generic font families in the Chrome browser. As previously mentioned, Chrome also displays generic font families correctly only for English. Of course, for other languages, generic font families are displayed correctly only for the respective language, but this is limited. I will set the serif and sans-serif fonts to Nodo fonts. CJK is a collective term for Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. Even fonts like Nodo, which aim to support all languages worldwide, integrate these three languages and distribute them as Nodo Sans CJK. The default font size is 16 pixels, but there is a difference where the default font for fixed-width fonts is 13 pixels. Chrome does not allow setting the default font size. Since default characters without a generic font family set may appear in different styles, browsers running the Blink engine require you to manually set the standard font as well. In English, serif is usually the default font, while in Korean, Japanese, etc., sans-serif is the default font. However, since sans-serif is preferred these days, I will set it to sans-serif regardless of the language. Just like WebKit engine browsers, I will configure Chrome to retain the addresses of previously visited websites. Now, Korean and Japanese generic font families are displayed correctly in Chrome as well. I will also check the generic font families in Epiphany. As expected, in the English environment, only English generic font families are displayed correctly in Epiphany. I will set the serif and sans-serif fonts to Noto, which also supports CJK. WebKit engine browsers allow you to set the font size for each generic font. It is unique that the unit is points rather than pixels. Multiplying a point by 1.3 gives the pixel size. In WebKit engine browsers, default characters that have not had a generic font family set are displayed in the serif font. Developer actions are disabled in Epiphany. I recommend enabling them if you are a web developer. Now, Korean and Japanese generic font families are displayed correctly in Epiphany as well. Finally, let's check the generic font families in Firefox. Unlike other browsers, generic font families are displayed correctly in Firefox regardless of the language. I will open the settings. The only setting I have configured in Firefox that differs from the default settings is to keep the addresses of the websites I have visited intact. This is the default state with no prior settings made regarding generic font families. Browsers running the Gecko engine can set the size of generic fonts. While you cannot set the size for each generic font individually, you can additionally set the size of fixed-width fonts. While Gecko engine browsers allow you to set a default font without a generic font families, they also provide a convenient feature that applies the generic font families configured in proportional. Serif is the default for English, but sans-serif is preferred for languages such as Korean and Japanese. Since serif fonts are primarily used in formal documents where readability is important, such as reports, theses, and printed publications, serif is the default font for web documents as well. However, sans-serif is preferred for languages with many strokes, such as Korean and Japanese. Furthermore, because sans-serif is highly preferred for electronic documents primarily used on monitor screens, there is a trend of favoring sans-serif over serif for web documents as well. Since proportional was set to sans-serif, the default font has also changed to the corresponding font. The font set in proportional must be refreshed for it to be reflected. I examined the current status of browser support for generic font families. Unfortunately, with the exception of Firefox, most browsers do not properly support generic font families. This is the case not only in Linux environments but also in Windows environments. Even in Windows, only Firefox properly supports generic font families. It also seems necessary to improve the fact that the generic font families supported by web browsers are limited to serif and sans-serif. I looked into the settings required to support generic font families across various web browsers. There is the inconvenience of having to configure settings individually for each browser, and having to download and install fonts like Noto to ensure visual harmony across various languages. If you develop a program expecting all clients to configure and use web browsers to display generic font families correctly, instances may occur where the appearance differs from your intention. I will create and upload a separate video covering methods to programmatically support generic font families. I will cover how to use serif and sans-serif as generic font families without being affected by the client environment. I will cover how to use Playwright like a generic font family. Since the cursive where characters are connected is not used in fonts other than English, I will use Playwright as a generic font family. Thank you for watching.